It was supposed to be a quiet night. The road was nearly empty, only a few streetlights casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. A lone car cruised down the street, an older sedan, nothing fancy, just a reliable ride. Inside sat a black man, driving home after a long day. Then came the flashing red and blue lights. At first, he thought nothing of it. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run a light. He pulled over calmly, rolling down his window, waiting for the officer to approach. But as soon as he saw the two white cops stepping out of the squad car, something in their body language set off alarm bells in his mind. They weren't just doing a routine stop. License and registration, one of them barked. His name tag read Reed. His partner, a younger officer with a mean smirk, hovered near the passenger side window, one hand resting on his holster. The driver, Daniel, handed over his documents without a word. He knew how this worked. No sudden moves. No arguments. Just let them do what they were going to do and get home safe. Reed took his time inspecting the license. "Where you headed?" "Home," Daniel answered, his voice calm. Reed nodded, then leaned in slightly. "Mind stepping out of the car?" Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He had done nothing wrong. But refusing could make things worse. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and got out, keeping his hands visible. The younger cop moved in, circling the car. He shined his flashlight inside, checking the seats, the floor, the glove compartment. Well, he suddenly whistled. "Look what we got here." Daniel turned his head just in time to see the cop pulling a small bag from under the driver's seat, one he knew wasn't there before. White powder. His stomach dropped. "That's not mine," he said immediately. Reed's smirk widened. "That so?" Before Daniel could say another word, the younger cop grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. "You're under arrest for possession of illegal substances," Reed said, fake sympathy dripping from his tone. "Guess you won't be making it home after all." Daniel stayed silent as the cold steel of handcuffs clamped around his wrists. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, but not from fear. No, he wasn't afraid. He had been through worse. Because unlike what these officers thought, Daniel wasn't just some ordinary man. He knew something they didn't. And when the truth came out, they were going to wish they had never pulled him over. Daniel sat in the back of the police cruiser, his wrists tight in the cold metal cuffs. The city lights blurred past the window as the squad car sped toward the station. He remained quiet, his face unreadable. The two officers in the front seat, however, were anything but silent. "Man, that was too easy," the younger cop chuckled, adjusting the rearview mirror to glance at Daniel. "Guy didn't even put up a fight." Reed smirked. "They never do when they know they're caught." Daniel said nothing. He had learned long ago that words wouldn't save him, not yet, anyway. When they arrived at the station, he was yanked from the car and marched inside. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as they led him down the long hallway toward booking. Other officers glanced at him but said nothing. Just another black man in cuffs, nothing new. They took his fingerprints, his mugshot, and then dumped him into a holding cell. The heavy metal bars clanged shut behind him. "You're looking at some serious time, buddy," Reed said through the bars, grinning. "That little bag? That's enough to ruin your life." Daniel tilted his head slightly, his expression calm. "That bag wasn't mine." Reed laughed. "Yeah? Tell that to the judge." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Daniel alone in the dimly lit cell. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and old concrete. Around him, other inmates sat slumped against the walls, lost in their own troubles. But Daniel wasn't like them. He wasn't afraid. He sat down on the hard bench, staring at the blank wall. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he reached into his shoe, retrieving a tiny, nearly invisible earpiece. He pressed it against his ear and whispered, "I need an extraction." A pause. Then a voice crackled softly in his ear. "Stand by." Daniel leaned back, exhaling slowly. He knew how this game worked. The system was built to keep people like him down. But what the cops didn't know was that he had been trained for situations far worse than this. He wasn't some helpless man caught in a bad situation. He was a CIA asset. And the man who had framed him had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Meanwhile, in the police station's main office, Officer Reed sat at his desk, typing up the report. His partner leaned against the doorway. "You think he'll take the plea?" the younger cop asked. Reed scoffed. "Doesn't matter. He won't have a choice. His public defender won't fight for him, and with the evidence we planted? Open and shut case." He hit save on the computer, then stretched his arms. Another easy win. But then something strange happened. The screen in front of him glitched. The file he had just saved disappeared. The entire system froze for a second, then a message popped up, "Access restricted." Reed frowned, clicking the mouse. Nothing. The screen turned black. What the? Before he could react, his desk phone rang. He picked it up. "Reed." A deep voice on the other end spoke, calm but firm. "Release him." Reed's grip on the phone tightened. "Who the hell is this?" Silence. Then, the line went dead. Reed slowly lowered the phone, his heart pounding. Something was wrong. Very wrong. For the first time that night, he was the one who felt afraid. Because whoever Daniel really was, he wasn't just another suspect. And someone, somewhere, wanted him free. Reed stared at his computer screen, the message "Access restricted" still glaring back at him. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but nothing worked. The system had been locked. His heart pounded in his chest. Something about this wasn't right. His partner frowned. "What's going on?" Reed didn't answer. He picked up the phone again and dialed the station's IT department. After a few rings, a voice answered. "This is Johnson." "This is Reed. Someone just hacked into our system. I need a trace, now." There was a pause. Then Johnson said, "Reed, there's nothing wrong with the system." Reed gritted his teeth. "I'm looking at it right now. The report on our guy just vanished. Someone's messing with us." Another silence. Then Johnson muttered, "I'll look into it." Reed slammed the phone down, his jaw clenched. This wasn't just some random guy they had picked up. Someone powerful wanted him out. In the holding cell, Daniel remained calm. He had spent years in situations far worse than this. His hands rested on his lap, his expression unreadable. Then, the heavy door at the end of the hall buzzed. Footsteps echoed as a uniformed officer approached. "Jackson, you got a visitor," the officer said. Daniel stood up. He hadn't used his real name in years, but it still felt strange hearing it. He followed the officer down the hallway, to a small interrogation room. Inside, an older man in a suit was already waiting. His silver hair was neatly combed, his sharp eyes locked onto Daniel the moment he walked in. The officer closed the door, leaving them alone. Daniel sat across from the man. "Didn't expect to see you again." The man adjusted his tie. "You should have stayed off the grid." Daniel smirked. "I tried." The man leaned forward, his voice lower now. "You've been compromised. This isn't just about those two cops. Someone higher up wanted you off the streets." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Why?" The man slid a small folder across the table. "They found out who you are." Daniel hesitated, then opened the folder. Inside was a printed report, his real file. Not the fake one that had been created for his cover. Daniel Jackson, former CIA operative. His stomach tightened. They weren't supposed to have this. His file had been sealed years ago. "They're using this charge to bury you," the man continued. "And if they succeed, you're never getting out." Daniel shut the folder. "Then we need to flip the script." The man studied him for a moment, then nodded. I made some calls. We're setting things in motion. Daniel exhaled slowly. He had spent years walking away from this life, from the agency, from the secrets. But now, he had no choice. It was time to fight back. Meanwhile, back in the station, Reed was growing restless. He had been a cop for years, but this was different. There were forces at play that he didn't understand. Then, his phone rang again. He hesitated before answering. Reed. This time, the voice was different, calm, but with authority. Officer Reed, I suggest you release your suspect. Reed's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? Silence. Then, the voice simply said. Check your email. The line went dead. Reed turned to his computer, which was now functioning again. His inbox had a new message. The subject line read, You made a mistake. He clicked it. A video loaded. His stomach dropped. It was security footage, from his own body cam. It showed exactly what had happened during the arrest. It showed the younger officer planting the drugs. It showed Reed going along with it. If this got out, they were finished. A bead of sweat rolled down his forehead. For the first time in his career, he knew he was on the losing side the day of Daniel's arraignment arrived. The courtroom was filled with tension as the judge took his seat. Rows of spectators lined the benches, some reporters, some familiar faces from the police department, and others who had simply heard whispers of what was about to unfold. Daniel sat at the defendant's table, his hands cuffed in front of him. Across from him, Officer Reed and his partner looked confident, smirking like they had already won. The prosecutor, a sharp-looking woman in a navy suit, stepped forward. Your Honor, the state is prepared to present clear evidence that the defendant was in possession of illegal substances at the time of his arrest. The judge, a stern man with graying hair, nodded. Proceed. Reed leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. He had been through this process before. The judge would hear the evidence, see the proof, and Daniel would be denied bail. Maybe even take a plea deal. Open and shut. But then, the unexpected happened. A man stood up from the back of the courtroom. He was dressed in a crisp suit, and the way he carried himself commanded attention. Your Honor, the man said, his voice steady. Before this hearing continues, I would like to submit new evidence on behalf of the defendant. Reed's smirk faded. The judge narrowed his eyes. And who might you be? The man reached into his pocket and pulled out an identification badge. The seal was unmistakable. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The courtroom went silent. Reed's mouth went dry. This was not part of the plan. The judge looked down at the badge, then back up. You may proceed. The FBI agent walked to the front of the courtroom and handed the judge a folder. This contains body cam footage from the officers in question. It was mysteriously missing from the original police report. The judge opened the folder, glancing through the documents before signaling the bailiff to bring the file over to the prosecutor. The moment the footage played on the courtroom screen, everything changed. The video showed everything, Reed's partner pulling the bag from his pocket before planting it under Daniel's seat. It showed Reed watching silently, allowing the setup to happen. The room erupted in whispers. The prosecutor's face paled. Your Honor, The judge raised a hand. Silence. His gaze shifted toward the two officers. Would the arresting officers like to explain this? Reed swallowed hard. His partner was already fidgeting in his seat. The FBI agent didn't wait. Your Honor, we have reason to believe that this is not an isolated incident. There are ongoing investigations into cases handled by these officers. Daniel remained still, but inside, he knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. The judge turned to the prosecutor. Given this new evidence, I have no choice but to dismiss all charges against the defendant. Furthermore, I expect a full internal investigation into the officers involved. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Reed shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding. The judge slammed his gavel. Sit down, Officer Reed. His voice was cold. This courtroom does not tolerate corruption. Reed sat, his face burning red. Daniel, still in his seat, exhaled slowly. He knew this wasn't over, not yet. Because if the FBI was involved now, that meant something much bigger was coming. Something even Reed wasn't ready for. And Daniel? He was just getting started. Daniel stepped out of the courthouse, the cold air hitting his face as he took his first deep breath of freedom. His hands were no longer in cuffs, but the weight of what had just happened still hung heavy in the air. Cameras flashed. Reporters crowded around him, shouting questions. Mr. Jackson. How do you feel about the case being dropped? Did you know the officers were framing you? What's your next move? Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. He had already won the first battle. Behind him, the doors of the courthouse burst open. Officer Reed and his partner stormed out, their faces tight with barely concealed anger. Their badges hadn't been taken yet, but Daniel knew that was only a matter of time. Hey, Jackson! Reed called out. Daniel turned slowly. Reed took a step closer, his voice low. You think you're safe now? He scoffed. This isn't over. Daniel studied him, then smirked. No, it's not. For the first time, Reed hesitated. There was something in Daniel's eyes that unsettled him. Before he could respond, two men in suits approached. Not reporters. Not officers. FBI. Officers Reed and Carter, one of them said, flashing a badge. We need to have a word with you. Reed's jaw clenched. Daniel didn't stick around to watch. He had bigger things to focus on. Later that evening, Daniel sat in a quiet diner, sipping a cup of black coffee. The place was nearly empty, the hum of a jukebox playing soft jazz in the background. Across from him sat the same FBI agent from the courtroom. His name was Agent Cole, a man Daniel had crossed paths with before. You really stirred up a hornet's nest, Cole said, stirring his own coffee. Daniel shrugged. I didn't frame myself. Cole smirked. True. He leaned back. But this case isn't just about you. Those two officers? They're small fish. Someone higher up gave them the green light to do what they did. Daniel had suspected as much. How high are we talking? Cole's expression darkened. High enough that they're trying to cover their tracks. Hard. Daniel set his cup down. What do you want from me? Cole exhaled. You used to be one of us, Jackson. You know how these things work. If we don't move fast, the people behind this will bury the evidence before we can get to them. Daniel remained quiet. He had walked away from this life for a reason. But now, he had been dragged back in. Cole leaned forward. Help us. If we expose this, it won't just clear your name, it'll take down an entire network of corrupt officers and officials. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. He knew what Cole was asking. He wasn't just asking for help. He was asking Daniel to go back to war. For a long moment, he stared at the coffee, his mind racing. Then, finally, he nodded. All right, he said. Let's burn it all down. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Officer Reed sat in his office, staring at his desk phone. His hands were clenched into fists. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Daniel should have been rotting in a cell by now. Then, his phone rang. Reed hesitated before picking it up. Yeah? A deep, unfamiliar voice spoke on the other end. You screwed up, Reed. Reed stiffened. Who is this? Silence. Then, the voice said, clean up your mess. Fast. Or you'll be the one taking the fall. Click. The line went dead. Reed swallowed hard. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just fighting to keep his job. He was fighting to stay alive. The city never truly slept, and neither did corruption. Inside a dimly lit office, Officer Reed sat at his desk, fingers drumming against the wooden surface. His mind raced as the last words from the mysterious caller echoed in his head. "Clean up your mess. Fast. Or you'll be the one taking the fall." Reed knew what that meant. He wasn't just in trouble, he was being discarded. Across from him, his partner, Carter, paced anxiously. "We're screwed, man. The FBI's sniffing around, the judge turned against us, and Jackson," he spat the name like venom, "is walking free. We need to do something." Reed clenched his jaw. "We are." He reached for his phone. "We make a call. We shut this down before it gets worse." Carter frowned. "What kind of call?" Reed dialed a number he never wanted to use. A number given to him a long time ago. Someone high up in the system who always made problems disappear. The line clicked. A voice answered. "Calm. Cold. Dangerous. You better have a damn good reason for calling me, Reed." Reed swallowed. "We have a situation. The Jackson case. It's spiraling out of control." Silence. Then, the voice on the other end said, "That's your mess to handle." Reed exhaled sharply. "I can't. The FBI's involved now. The case was dismissed, and Jackson's working with them. He's digging." The line was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, the voice said, "Then bury him before he finds something we can't cover." The call ended. Reed set the phone down, his hands trembling. Carter stared at him. "What did they say?" Reed looked up, his eyes hard. "We take Jackson out. One way or another." Meanwhile, Daniel sat in his apartment, staring at a folder filled with classified documents. Agent Cole had given him the first few pieces of the puzzle, evidence that Reed and Carter were just foot soldiers in something much bigger. A network of dirty cops. False convictions. Suppressed evidence. It went deeper than he had imagined. His phone vibrated. A text from Cole. "They know you're digging. Be careful." Daniel sighed. He had spent years in the shadows, moving in silence. He knew how dangerous people like Reed could be when backed into a corner. They wouldn't let this go. A knock at the door snapped him back to reality. He reached for his gun, not because he wanted trouble, but because he knew it was coming. He opened the door slowly. A woman stood there, her eyes scanning him with an urgency that sent alarms through his mind. "I need to talk," she said quickly, glancing over her shoulder. "They're coming for you." Daniel frowned. "Who are you?" She hesitated, then whispered, "My name is Officer Anna Hayes. I used to work under Reed. And I have proof that could bring them all down." Daniel stepped aside, letting her in. Whatever she knew, it was big. And it meant time was running out. At the same time, Reed sat in his unmarked car outside Daniel's apartment, a cigarette burning between his fingers. Through the windshield, he could see Daniel's silhouette inside, talking to someone. Carter sat beside him, restless. "We should just go in now." Reed shook his head. "Not yet." He took a drag of his cigarette, exhaling slowly. His hands weren't shaking anymore. He had made his decision. Daniel Jackson wasn't going to make it to the end of this investigation. By tomorrow morning, he'd either be dead or gone forever.